Okay, we will start the second part of this conversation, which is also the final session of our 12th meeting of the Council of Councils. So welcome to all of you. I'm very happy to share this panel, which will continue the discussion between Richard and Thierry. I will start by introducing you our panelists, which are representing different parts of the world. And the idea is to ask them their prediction, their prevision for the next 10 years to build up the international agenda. And it is at the core of the Council of Councils all the time to compare our vision and to try to frame jointly a common agenda. So very often we disagree, but part of the beauty of the job in the think tanks. But precisely as it was said previously, these disagreements are very important to understand the mindset of our different partners. So let me introduce first Patrycja Sasnal, who is the research director at the PISM, which is a Polish Institute for International Affairs, which is representing Europe this afternoon. On her left, Carlos Simonsen, which is the president of the Getulio Vargas Foundation, coming from Brazil. On his left, Rohinton Medhora, which is the president of CG, coming from Canada. Samir Saran, which is with the president of the ORF, coming from India. And to finish this panel, Michel Plein d'Amour, also known as Michael Fullilove, who is the executive director of the Lowy Institute, coming from Australia. You can speak French, Michel, if you want. So rules of the game are very, very simplistic this afternoon. Each of you have 5 minutes to list the main priorities in terms of setting up the international agenda for the next 10 years. And after that, we'll have a short discussion and give the possibility to our friends to raise questions before finishing. So, Patrycja, the floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here, to be part of this conversation, and represent the European/Polish point of view about the next decade for think tanks. I want to structure my short intervention around the word post-war, because I think it's not by chance that the Council on Foreign Relations was established in 1921, which is after the First World War, and it's not a coincidence why the Chatham House was established in 1920. The Polish Institute of International Affairs in its own old incarnation was established in 1940s. It's because we are part of this normative order, this post-war normative order, an order that is not agnostic to the duos, war, peace, stability, instability, freedom, unfreedom, multilateralism, unilateralism, justice, injustice. This is part of our mission, part of foreign policy think tank's mission. I am mentioning it because 2 points for the agenda for the next 10 years for the European think tanks can be inferred from this point. One is the international law, which is the basis of this normative post-war order, and the cases of its violation need to be monitored, examined, analyzed fully, be it Russian aggression in Crimea, or be it the United States calling illegal settlements on the Palestinian occupied territories legal. This is point number one. Point number two is United Europe. United Europe, which is the greatest achievement of this normative post-war order. We need, as think tanks, to look more into the possibilities of further European integration. This is what the public expects us to. This is what Richard has talked about, that we need to now reach out to the wider audience and the society. And if we listen to the society, the support for European Union, for further integration. The trust in the European Union is at all-time high since the early 1980s. We have 68% of Europeans who trust and believe in the European Union. We need to respond to that. This is not to say that we should ignore the outer challenges for the United Europe, and here I refer to the PBT factor that Carl Bildt coined, the Putin, Brexit, Trump factor, or I should say PBC-T, Putin, Brexit, China, Trump factor. But we will work on that anyway, right? This is not something that should be put specifically on the agenda. So this is United Europe. And then point number 3 is climate change. Now, we need to look again at the polls. More than 70% Europeans, and these are polls done in the run-up to the Katowice COP last year, more than 70% of Europeans fear climate change. Now, in the south of Europe, it's more than 80%, which means that it has become now a bipartisan issue. It's no longer a lefty point on the agenda. It's a point on the agenda that the European society demands of us to analyze and think about its international consequences. One point about think tanks and climate change. Very, very important. Our think tank carbon footprint is incredible, is enormous. We live up in the air. We fly constantly. What we should do is we need to cut down on our flying, choose carefully the conferences that we go to. I can ask my fellow heads of research and directors the question, how often or how many times this year have you been to a conference that did not really bring much added value to your research? And I'm sure you would say that there were a couple. So we need to promote webinars, we need to promote remote conferences, something we do very rarely. Final point, also with reference to what Thierry and Richard talked about financing. I don't see a danger in government financing. Actually, my institution is a public institution. It is government financed. But we do have a level of independence when it comes to, we do not analyze internal politics. It's not democratic governments, it's not allied governments financing that is problematic. What's problematic is financing from governments that we are in pseudo wars in information or ideological wars in. And here I mean China, Russia, and there's another problematic source of financing, which is some corporate financing also. So I also add to what Richard said, that full transparency, putting on our websites, point by point, sources of our financing and the programs that they are financed from, or ideally, cutting off that problematic financing altogether. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrycja. Carlos, right microphone, because at the end I won't have a microphone.
Good afternoon to everyone. First, I should say that I entirely subscribe to what Thierry and Richard said. And I know that they could have spoken for 3 days more each one on each of those subjects. And they couldn't do that, of course. And I will not extend myself into subjects. I will go to a very French thing. I'll speak about method. As Rivarol said, the methods are the habits of a spirit. So we are trying to develop those in order to have a resilient think tank. We operate in many areas, not only in international relations, and we obviously have many problems, including cost, including the quality of what we produce, etc., etc. But above all, as it was said, we have to target demand. And the question of targeting demand in the long run is a very difficult one. Why? Because you have perceived demand, which is also attended, you have perceived demand, which is not attended to, and you have unperceived demand, which is not attended, of course, but that's where you want to be in the future. And therefore, you have to develop what your own technologies, which you may call your own capacities. And this roadmap for innovation is a very, very, very tricky thing because it may become too expensive. You have to have a long-term view in order to set your bets. So, from a Brazilian point of view, what do we think for the next 15 years? We hope that our reforms will continue, that a greater degree of institutionalization is bound to happen. It is happening. It has been happening steadily for the last years. Foreigners don't perceive that, but it's happening. The second thing, Brazil will have to open more. It is opening, but it will have to open much more. It will have to integrate much more. We have to stop wanting to be on Mars, okay? The third thing is Brazilian society is changing a lot. Its demands in the past were easy. Public policies were just transfers. Now they have to deal with provision of services, which is incredibly difficult because it's not taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. It doesn't work. We have spent a hell of a money in education for meager results. So that's the third point. The fourth point in the long run is, well, in terms of how we do research, maybe we should use what I simplify by naming it the 5G. We have artificial intelligence, we have tons of data coming, and we work basically in social sciences, applied social sciences, and we have this, we come to this with new possibilities, like, for example, mimicking something that social sciences usually avoids, which is replicability of experiments, and so forth. So these are issues that are very important. At the end, this construction of a long term, for us, of course, there's a fifth thing. The world is going to become much more complicated. Maybe, just maybe, the Pax Americana, it's at an end. So how can we be relevant in the next 5, 10, 15 years if we don't have a long-term vision and if we don't prepare ourselves to do much better than what we do today? We have to go more into facts, into deeper analysis. We have to be more consequential. We have to have the academic rigor of the universities, but an applicability that think tanks do usually have and that universities don't have. We have to match them both. So this is what we think for the future. It's a question, as Rivarol said, of methods. Methods are the habits of a spirit. We have to change the habits of our spirits, at least at FGV.
Thank you, Carlos. Rohinton.
Thomas, thank you. In Canada, we had an election about a month ago, and I only wish we were having this panel tomorrow because the cabinet is going to be named tomorrow, and I'd be able to give you a better sense. But in some ways, the election was very much about the kinds of issues you want us to talk about. So I'd say 2/3 of the Canadian electorate voted for what we could loosely call progressive parties. The Liberals, our Social Democratic Party, our Green Party, and a separatist party in Quebec, which tends to be left-leaning. That shows in some ways where Canada as a whole perhaps stands, but it also shows, as in many countries, the divisions within the country, which are regional, and they also have to do with a country that's moving increasingly away from its natural resource base to something else. We don't know what that something else is. And that, in some senses, is reflected in the discussion we had during the campaign, before and after, on how we balance prosperity, social equity, and our place in the world. What might that mean in practice going ahead? I'd say 3 things. One, I won't repeat and go into detail, but clearly climate change as an existential threat, but also as an opportunity in some ways for green tech and an innovation economy is something that we should all be thinking about. Whether Canada has what it takes to be a serious player in these discussions is an open question in my country, and we can come back to that. I think sometimes we're correctly accused of talking a big game but not delivering. 0.28% is what we devote to ODA. We're far from our Paris commitments, and yet we position ourselves as this Pearsonian middle power that wants to make a better world. And I think that's something we as Canadians have to face, but climate change, clearly. Second, and Carlos alluded to this, and this I think is one I would fully endorse, is that we're moving to an age driven by high technology, by innovation, and by things that we couldn't have imagined. There's a whole global governance agenda. I'd say after climate change, the biggest gap in multilateralism is that we don't have institutions, even imperfect ones, to deal with the numbers of issues that the innovation agenda has thrown up. Let me just leave you with 4. We don't have the equivalent of a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that would govern how ethics can be situated in artificial intelligence, but we need something of that level. We don't have a regime that can mediate between the balkanization of data around the world. Currently, we're broken into 3 blocks. I mean, there's the state-centric China block. There's its mirror image in the US, which is the firm-centric US block. And then here you have the GDPR, allegedly person-centric. You cannot be a firm and operate in all 3 zones and be compliant. You just cannot. We do not have globalization anymore. It's not because it cannot happen, but we haven't even given it a chance. I think this is the big thing that the G20 and diplomacy could work out. And countries like India, like Canada, that fall outside these blocks, I think are well positioned to mediate there. Third, how do we deal with digital multinationals that are natural monopolies? There's a series of taxation, content, privacy, security, regulation issues that can only be done multilaterally. Otherwise, we don't get anywhere. And so finally, and my organization has sort of made this case, just as we created institutions at Bretton Woods that then sort of governed the way things happened, in the digital world, we would need an equivalent. We would need a digital stability board, just as we now have a financial stability board, that would get both carrots and sticks in place for some of these norms to be created. And then the third point I'd make on the 10-year agenda, which is implicit in the first 2, is how do we, we talk, especially in Europe, and you've done it well here, subsidiarity is a principle in both economics and political science that we apply. What does subsidiarity mean when it comes to globalization? How do we balance bilateral exigencies with plurilateral agreements with multilateralism? So if you're the WTO today, what exactly are you regulating when your own database shows that there's something like 166 regional and plurilateral agreements that are in force? So that spaghetti bowl of issues that has to be sorted out, and you say, how much is at the apex? How much is done more locally? Is something that we need to get more serious about as we confront things like countries that might not share our values, and yet we have to deal with them and live with them.
Thank you, Rohinton. I turn now to Samir.
Thank you, Thomas, and let me first congratulate you and Theory for 40 years of research excellence and actually giving definition to the word think tank for the people of France. Let me try and approach this slightly differently. And I don't speak for India or the Indian think tank system. I'm just one of 1.3 billion people, and I'm prone to changing my mind. So this is my view at this moment. But if I was to, in some sense, try and look ahead over the next decade and see what are the big issues that all of us need to respond to urgently. I think I see 5 collisions that are underway, and it is our job to manage those collisions. The first big collision underway is the collision of 3 oceans, and this is very new. The Atlantic Ocean is colliding with the Indian Ocean, is colliding with the Pacific Ocean. And it's happening for the first time because previously when the Atlantic Ocean merged into all of these, it was the Atlantic ecosystem that dominated. It was the Atlantic view of the world that defined the politics of the Pacific, that defined the politics of the Indian Ocean. Now when these waters merge, you have a vibrant counter-narrative in each of these places. The Chinese have their own game in town. The Indians are gradually building their own play in their own immediate neighborhood. The East Africans and the South Africans and the Brazilians and the Australians are beginning to move away from the Atlantic system. So the first collision underway is the politics of these three waters are now contesting each other. And there are no global institutions that exist to manage this collision. The global institutions were created out of the Atlantic crucible. They were meant to define the Atlantic order. They were meant to benefit the incumbents of the Atlantic system. They were never meant to accommodate the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of other powers. And therefore, my first point is that should we be defending a rules-based order, or is it time to now write a more democratic rules-based order? So I think when people say in defense of the rules-based order, I say go to hell with the rules-based order. Let's now write new rules for a world which is very different. And I don't think the incumbents are ready to do that, and that is the first takeaway. That can we move towards a new script, and who will be sitting on the table over the next decade to write this new script, because it is going to be written. Either in contest or in collaboration, we can make a choice now. So that's one. The second collision underway is two continents are colliding. And this is really important. People don't realize that neither the Americans, nor the Brits, nor the French, nor anyone else could do what the Chinese have done. They have connected Europe and Asia into the supercontinent. The Belt and Road Initiative is not about subjugating South Asia or the Indians or the Nepalese or the Sri Lankans. We are small, $3-4 trillion markets for them. They want the soul of Europe. They want the $20 trillion European market to be deeply integrated with Chinese production, Chinese services, Chinese progress. And the Chinese are doing this very ably and capably. The 17+1 might be a bigger body in the next 10 years than the EU 27 or EU 28, depending on the numbers left with you. And I think that's the next big question that we need to respond to. That when Asia and Europe merge into the supercontinent, what will be the sub-regional balance of power? Is EU relevant in that context? Is South Asia relevant in this context? But the Chinese don't see the sub-regional divisions. They see this big market, and they see an opportunity of a lifetime to be a dominant actor in that market space. And I am not attributing any malicious intent to them. It's only business. So in the process of business, how are they going to change the politics of communities that have resided in these two land masses is something that we need to think about. Again, no institution exists to manage this collision. The OSCE and a few others have been feeble attempts to manage parts of it. The SCO is just born and managing the eastern flank of it. The EU is protecting the previous 3 centuries with little relevance to the current. And we need to see how do we create a new order to manage this collision of continents. So that's the second collision that is underway. The third collision I will not dwell on, but I will just reiterate what Rohinton and others have mentioned, is the collision of the digital with the real. There is nothing called the digital domain anymore. Everything you do online has real world consequences. And this collision is now starkly upon us. You tweet something, it has real world implications. You can destroy nuclear facilities, you can create fires, you can bring down cities, you can shut down governments. You can shut down banking systems and monetary systems as well. Central Bank of Bangladesh was robbed a few years ago. Many of our banks have faced these threats at all. So there is, I think the distinction between digital and real is over. That collision is complete. Institutions don't exist, as Rohinton has mentioned, and he's also elaborated quite eloquently on what needs to be done immediately. The fourth collision is something of our own making. The planet is colliding with people, and climate change and many other rapacious behavior of human civilization is plundering the planet. And I think planet and people are not at peace with each other, from biodiversity to forest fires to cyclones and hurricanes. And I mean, you ask me how many times I'm in the air. I'm in the air all the time. And I fear that we don't even understand how the jet stream and other high altitude winds are changing because of what we are doing on Earth. And that is one of my constant fear. I'm a nervous flyer, but I'm up in the air like you mentioned quite often. So I think that collision is underway, and I don't think we have found means to handle this problem without a passport, because this is a global issue. It's not a territorial or national issue. And the final collision is, I think, between the idea of a world defined by global orders versus a world now being organized through coding of platforms. I think we are moving from globalization to platformization. So we are now a platform world. We are either in the US ecosystem, in the European ecosystem, in the Chinese ecosystem. We are either Huawei or Awe, or we have different solutions and different codings and different ethics and different values that are ascribed to how we consume, how we communicate, how we date, how we split, how we do anything. And it's very social. And I think this is the last point I want to make, that typically think tanks have focused quite remarkably successfully on political economies. They've done well when it comes to understanding political trends, economic trends, suggestions and interventions. They have done rather poorly, and this is true. And this is where I think the point Richard made, where we require a renaissance of social sciences to help us in today's age. We have done badly when it comes to studying societies. We've been a largely incestuous elite set that has been obsessed with the echo chambers we have inhabited, and we have not necessarily done well in understanding the street. We have understood Wall Street, we have not understood main streets. And I think we get surprised, oh my God, this happened. This happened because you were not listening. The street was shouting out loud, but you were not listening to the street. You were sitting in this room and you were having a conversation among those who think like you. So I think we have done badly in understanding society. The current disruption that we are facing is changing society as we know it. We cannot make any assumptions about society anymore. And if the human being is now unpredictable, what use is having any form of predictions around public policy or trend lines or politics? I think we have to connect to the humans. How we do it is the challenge of the next 10 years. And certainly, I think we will have to transform dramatically as institutions to be able to be partners to this. I mean, it's shameful that ORF, Brookings, CFR, XYZ could not do what Greta Thunberg could do. An individual with a hashtag could mobilize the planet on climate change. And these hoity-toity institutions have very little political impact on this debate. The same is true of many other gender debates and other debates around the world. Today, people on the street are able to have greater influence because the people are colliding with, the platform is colliding with the global order that we created. And I think this collision is really seminal.
Thank you, Samir. I move now to Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you, Thomas and Ifri and CFR for having us, and congratulations on your birthday. Thomas rather cheekily introduced me as Michel Plan d'Amour, and it is true that I do have a sneaking affection for France. It is true that the family legend in my family is that we were originally Plan d'Amours before we moved to England, but I've never actually met a French person called Plan d'Amour, so I'm a little bit suspect. My father fought in France in the Second World War. My mother was born on Bastille Day, and my family used to live on Pérouse Road in Sydney, which was named after the Comte de la Pérouse, who landed in Botany Bay only a few days after Arthur Phillip and the First Fleet in 1788. So if the Count had been just a couple of days earlier, then my French accent would be a lot better, Thomas. What issues are Australians concerned about? Well, Australians have traditionally thought about the world in a three-dimensional way, where those dimensions are height and width and depth. Height is our link to a global partner, and first Britain, then the United States. We've always tried to play a global role, if a small one, and you can see our dead littered around the world, not only in France, but in Sinai and in Palestine and in Greece and Crete and North Africa and all sorts of places you wouldn't expect Australian soldiers to lie because of that height dimension. Secondly, width, which is the links, the connections to international institutions and the international order. And thirdly, depth, our engagement with Asia and the Pacific. So if I think about those three dimensions, there are lots of reasons for Australians to be concerned about all three. First of all, on the height dimension. We have a President of the United States whose worldview is completely alien to most Australians' worldview. On alliances, Mr. Trump is an alliance skeptic, whereas Australians are alliance believers. On free trade, Mr. Trump doesn't believe in any free trade agreements, whereas Australia is a trading nation. On America, the tradition of American leadership, Australians have always welcomed that, and Mr. Trump scoffs at it. When it comes to strongmen, Mr. Trump has a weird affinity for strongmen, whereas Australia is an old democracy and a free society. So I think we worry about that. We worry about his worldview which I think has largely informed US foreign policy on alliances, on leadership, on free trade, on strongmen and democracies. I think there are limits to, his writ doesn't run everywhere, and there are limits to the influence that Mr. Trump has had on Trump foreign policy. But that's the first thing we worry about, because we think that we have a stake in the global balance of power, and when our like-minded ally is off track, we're concerned about it. Secondly, in terms of width, and Samir mentioned the rules-based order. Well, Australia is a believer in the rules-based order. We're a believer in institutions. We are joiners by instinct and practice. We are always fighting to be admitted into institutions, even if those institutions don't want to have us. If they won't have us, or there's no institution that will work, then we propose an institution. So we like institutions, and yet we know that the planet is heating up. We know there are more refugees now than at any time since the Second World War. We know that the institutions are not fit for practice. And we believe in rules. A country of Australia's size benefits greatly from an international order in which the rules of the road are well established and widely observed. And indeed, we put out a foreign policy white paper about 18 months ago, and the rules-based order was the central organising principle of it. And yet, neither President Trump nor President Xi believes in rules. Mr. Trump doesn't believe that rules apply to him as a human being, let alone to his country. Both President Trump and President Xi believe that the rules-based order current rules are rigged against their countries. So this is a problem for us. And as an institute and as a country, we need to try to identify what rules we can support, where rules need to change, because surely rules need to change. But the idea of an order in which countries follow the rules is important to us. Finally, the third dimension, Thomas, is depth, our relations with Asia and with the Pacific. Wealth and power are moving towards Asia. So we're used to a world in which geopolitics happen a long way away. Well, that's finished. It happens around us now, as Samir mentioned. Asia touches everything we do and everything we think about. The most consequential country in Asia is China. China takes 40% of Australians' exports. It's our leading trading partner, and yet it is a peer competitor of our great ally. It is now the biggest news story in Australia. This week, there are stories on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, on the trade war, on political interference, on hacking of Australian institutions, on detention of our citizens, on foreign investment, on economic coercion, and other stories. It is the biggest news story in my country. It is the biggest foreign policy issue in my country. This week, Mr. Keating, my former boss, actually gave a speech on China. A couple of weeks ago, I hosted Mr. Morrison, the Prime Minister, who spoke on China. Next week, I'm hosting Mr. Abbott, the former Prime Minister, who's also going to speak on China. Australian policy has hardened very significantly towards China. Australian public opinion has hardened. In fact, there's been a 20% drop in Australians' trust of China in a single year in Lowy Institute polling. Increasingly, we're focused on how we maintain our independence and our autonomy and our sovereignty in a region which may be dominated by China. And yet, for all that, and even though we're a liberal democracy trying to make our way with a giant country run by a Leninist political party, we need to have a good relationship with China, because our economy depends on the Chinese economy, and because China is an important country, a civilizational country, and a country that deserves respect. So how do we learn to cooperate with China when our interests overlap, disagree with China when our interests diverge, but always be clear and consistent. And finally, Thomas, just to finish, it's important, especially, but not only because I'm sitting next to Samir, that we do not shrink this third dimension. We do not shrink the continent of Asia to one country, China. It's important for all the other countries in the region that we have our own space, we have our own independence and autonomy. So we think, in Australia, we think about the relationship with India, with Japan, with Indonesia, with Vietnam, with South Korea, with other Asian countries. And finally, we think about the Pacific, the immediate, the near abroad for Australia, the Pacific Islands region, which is an underdeveloped region. It's a region where traditionally Australia has dominated, but it's a region where external players, and in particular China, are increasingly exerting their influence. So that's the third dimension for us, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Michael. I have two questions before going to the room. The very first question is for Patrycja and for you, Michael. If we try to see some steps before 2030, there is 2024. There will be a new European Commission this year, I mean, in 2024. And one thing is pretty sure, President Trump won't be the US president in 2024. I did pretty sure. Something which is also pretty sure, but maybe less, it is the fact that President Putin won't be the president of Russia. Maybe it's prime minister, but that's another business. That's another debate. So my question is to Michael and to Patrycja. What sort of world without President Trump and President Putin, but with President Xi Jinping? You go first.
Well, I might focus on President Trump and perhaps because he looms larger for us than President Putin. And I think the biggest question in relation to the United States is whether America can snap back after President Trump. Because you're right that the Trump presidency too will pass. Whether it's, however it ends, it will end at some point. And then the question is, given that he has been such a discontinuity in US history, to what extent can America revert? And the glass half empty says that America has been on this track for a long time. It was on this track probably from halfway through President Bush's administration, that certainly Obama was retrenching, that Trump has doubled down on it. I think whether he is re-elected next year is a big factor here, because I think if President Trump is elected once, that's one thing. But if Americans look at 4 years of President Trump and say, we like that and we'll have another 4 years of it, I think that will entrench the trend of retrenchment, and it will further change the way the rest of us think about the United States. But there's also a glass half full way of thinking about it, and that is, I think we are often too quick to extrapolate trends and to go to the full extreme. And the United States will retain the muscle memory of being the world hegemon for a long time. It still is a huge economy, an entrepreneurial people. It is blessed by geography. It has a huge military. It has a people. You see the opinion polls, the most recent opinion polls, you have seen a return to support for trade and immigration, and America playing a great role in the world. So nothing is forever, and in 100 years the United States is not going to be playing the role of world hegemon. But I think that America maybe can survive President Trump.
Yeah, I think I agree with Michael, although I'm afraid that it's much less likely that he will be voted out of office than that he will stay. 3 points maybe about President Trump, America post-Trump, if there is a democratic president. Point number one, transatlantic relations. I think there'll be a lot done to mend whatever's been broken even if it's just the cracks that appear on the surface, I think there'll be a lot of work to mend the ties, transatlantic ties. Point number 2, the Paris Climate Agreement. America will double down on the efforts to confront climate changes, and this will be done on the federal level. We know it's happening on the state level and on city level, but a lot more will be done on the federal level. And then point number 3, it's the Middle East and relations with Iran. So the Democrats are saying that they're going to go back to the JCPOA, which by that time would have to be renegotiated. There'll be very little time for the agreement to still be there in place. So it will most probably be renegotiated, and Iran will be willing to do that. And second point about the Middle East, there'll be a lot more balance in relations between the US and Israel. Because for the first time in history, and this result is the creation of Netanyahu and Trump, for the first time in American Israeli relations, this issue has become a partisan issue. That is, Democrats are changing their opinions about relations with Israel. And I think they will be much more balanced once there is a democratic president. Now, just one word about Putin. I think we are hopeful that Russia will change once Putin is gone, or, I mean, surely if he is the prime minister, nothing will change. But if he is gone completely, okay, let's assume for a minute. But I don't think we can jump to this conclusion that Russian policies will change very quickly. Russia, it is said, has 3 borders. A psychological border with the West, which has been there since the Cold War or earlier. The demographic border with the East, which is China. And I think there's too much eggs put in the basket of Russian-Chinese cooperation. There's a lot of rivalry boiling up between the surface. And then this third border that Russia has, which is a cultural one with the Muslim world in the south. Now, Russia needs a lot of immigration. It's an aging population. And I think if anywhere, this immigration can come from the south, and these are Muslim societies. So I think Russia is in a very precarious situation, and if you're in a precarious situation, you tend to act unpredictably. So I would not assume that Russian policies will change once Putin is gone.
Thank you. In all the think tanks around the table and the think tanks participating in the Council of Councils, there is a focus in terms of research, which is the relation between the US and China. All of us are working very consistently on that, given the fact that it is seen as the more structural relation for the coming decade. My second question is related to this focus. If also I anticipate 2024, and if I read the demographic prevision, it is the year when the Indian population will be more numerous than the Chinese population. So my question to Carlos, to Rohinton, and to Samir is the following. If we are too much focused on the relation between China and the US in the coming decade, what sort of other big relation we can miss? And especially, for instance, is there a risk, maybe in Europe, not to be enough focus on the relation between India and China, for instance? So what sort of other big issue, rather than the relation between the US and China, do you anticipate in the next decade? Carlos, you go first.
So first of all, let me give you a piece of information. Maybe at my institution we study Europe more than the relation between the US and China. We study the US a lot, but Europe is very important for us. Look, the other thing that we study profoundly, and we miss, I recognize there's more studies on India. We are counting with our Indian friends to solve that problem. But the other thing that we study a lot is energy. Right now, there are 2 big exporters of energy, Russia and the United States, and 2.5 big importers, China, Europe, India, but India uses lots of coal, Japan, so you may either put India or Japan. And that is a very relevant issue, because for geopolitical reasons, for political reasons, you have Venezuela out of a game, or coming out of a game, Iraq out of a game, Iran out of a game, now, per coincidence, Saudi Arabia out of a game. So, who is gaining, who is losing? Okay? And if you start with a very old question, a very, very simple question, who is the enemy of my enemy? That is bound to be my friend. So, you see that we are at a time when structural, taken for granted relations are bound to change. At the same time, in Brazil, we are a mid-size, 3 million barrels a day producer of oil. We consume about 2.2, 2.4, so we don't export much, but we may increase in the next 5 years that production to 5 million. And that is mostly in the ocean, okay, in the Atlantic Ocean. And I presume that we will have a very big geopolitical issue there. This is not a simple thing. This is a very complicated thing. So, and not many people in Brazil are aware of that. So we love when Total buys things, assets there. We love when Chevron buy assets. We love when the Chinese buy assets. If everyone is buying assets there to take oil out from there, they will pay taxes, of course. They will pay the Brazilian part of the oil, but also there will be a common divided interest. It's a tricky thing. So what do we study? Of course, we look at the United States against China, the competition. We don't see it with rosy eyes. We see the problems in Europe, Brexit, the current division, the problems with the euro. I have listened, people think that, well, the euro, for me, it's a big, sophisticated currency board with a central bank that does certain things, but not all the things that a central bank could do. The next step should be to introduce a unified budget. But one thing is to have a budget and a currency introduced at the same time. Another thing is to introduce a federal budget after you have a currency, because you have a problem of how do you redistribute the existing risks? What's the effect of that budget on the risks? So we study that. We study industrial policies in the countries. We try to understand how we can attract investment to Brazil. Many Europeans think that we need money from Europe. This is not true. We need technology. And moreover, we need less product technology and more process technology, meaning organization. In Brazil, what we lack is organization. It's not necessarily product technology. And we need to leverage our service industry, integrating it with classical industry. And that is what we study broadly. But, for example, in the case of Spain, 6 or 7 years ago, there was a paper from FGV saying the future crisis, political crisis in Spain and our electricity system, because Spaniards invested a lot in our electricity companies. And the story came about inevitably.
So I think your question was about India and coalitions beyond US and China.
My question is, in fact, if we are too much focused on the relation between China and the US, maybe there is a risk, to miss something very important. What can be this
sure
important other issue?
There sure is. And so, Patrycja would be pleased to know that right after the reception to this meeting, I get on a plane to go to Mumbai, where we've been running for some time an initiative, Canada-India, on improving that link. For the reasons you said, I've said in the past that for many countries, India is the $20 bill you see on the street that no one's picked up. And no one picks it up because everyone thinks, gosh, it couldn't be for real. Someone would have picked it up by now. Must be a fake note. And India is that opportunity. Now, having said that, let's be real. The US-China dynamic is not going to go away anytime soon. You asked about, how much might we snap back post-Trump? There are some things, there's no snapping back. Whoever wins the next election, the one after, the US-China dynamic has nothing to do with personalities and styles and who's. So, India, we keep playing it up, but it's still a fraction of China's economy in absolutely every way. There are some things India does really well, soft power. Many countries of the world kind of like the values that India stands for as opposed to China, but I don't think it's pragmatic to think of India as a counterbalance to China quite yet. There's nothing near the bridge you were talking about in terms of India's grand vision. There's nothing near the BRI. So rather than think in terms of India or coalitions, I would say, to quote a certain musician, give the G20 a chance. That's all I'm saying. It's rather than coalitions, let's think of the issues we talked about: climate change, innovation, trade, and say, what might a win-win situation look like in which we don't see China as an adversary, but we see it as an embrace in which both sides have a reason to be embraced. And I think there's ways to think about coalition building through that means. I happen to be still, despite the fact that it's in drift, I have considerable faith in the G20 as the only mechanism we have that balances the exclusivity and unreality of the G7 with the you all comes of vision of the UN. I think the G20 is a balance between voice and efficiency. It has all the right people around the table. Select your spots and create conditions in which China does not feel it does not have to play ball, but for reasons of preserving its own social stability, its own value chains, it would buy into certain norms to do with data. It might buy into certain norms to do with trade, and vice versa.
Samir, are you ready to embrace your neighbors? I mean, not Michael and Rohinton.
Depends which side, east or west. But I think I more or less agree with Rohinton that the G20 still remains a potential. Sorry, is it okay?
I'll take the other one, maybe.
I'll take the other one. Yeah. So I think I would agree with Rohinton. The G20 is an opportunity. I don't think it's necessarily living up to its promise, but I think that's because the political capital required to give it heft has not necessarily been committed by many of us. And yes, I think that's 2020. I mean, normally these big global clubs come to India to die. We had the Global Commission on Cyberspace that has never seen the light of the day after it did the Delhi edition. So I hope that G20, when it comes to Delhi, does not meet that fate, and I hope we infuse some new energy. But to your point, what's happening between US and China is not Trump and Xi Jinping. It's the deep state agreeing with the loud state. So here it's a coincidence that Trump and the deep state agree. But the deep state had reached the conclusion that the decoupling must happen. Now, the pace, the stylistic elements around the decoupling, the noise around it, may be personality-driven. But the fact that there is a realization in the strategic community in America that China is a clear and present challenger and danger is bipartisan in nature. So I don't think it is going to change in 2024. It's going to be a problem that's truly alive and kicking. And I fear that where we are really dropping the ball is we are not focusing enough on the only player who still plays the geopolitical chessboard better than anyone else. And you had asked that question to the previous two panelists. Let me intervene. Putin is very good. So let's be very clear about it. He plays the chessboard better than anyone else. And let me try to explain Putin's craft, because I don't think we give him enough credit for what he does. With a $1.3 trillion economy, he has the political weight of a $16 to $20 trillion economy. It's not easy to do that. It's not easy to have no money in your coffers, but have an omnipresence in every conflict in the world. Now, that's one part of it. But let me tell you why I'm worried about that particular actor. It's not because he has the skill set, he's the craftiest player on the chessboard. Why I'm worried about Russia is that not only does he have the skill set, and not only is he the craftiest player on the geopolitical chessboard, he doesn't have a stake in stability. And that is what worries me, truly because of this. I don't think the US-China relationship is going to destabilize the world dramatically. Both have $20 trillion stakes in maintaining stability. They are invested in energy chains, they are invested in technology chains, they are invested in trade routes, they are invested. They are going to compete for influence and control and order and direction. But they are not going to blow up pipelines. They are not going to bring down the internet. They are not going to destroy the ecosystems of innovation, because both are profiting from it. The competition is who should profit more. Russia doesn't have that stake in it. The Russians have no reason not to bring down the innovation system of another country, because they don't have the same stake. So I think the biggest challenge for the global community is how do we give Russia more stake in stability. And I think, therefore, for me, the two relationships to watch out for in the next 5 years is, one, can Russia diversify away from China and try and complete that process that is very feeble at this stage, the Japanese-Russian relationship, and create the Vladivostok as the Silicon Valley equivalent of Russia, and allow the fourth IR to give Russia an economy that will make it a stable. So that's one relationship that we should watch out for, and I think that might happen in the next 5 years. The other relationship, of course, that we should watch out for is the European relationship with Russia. If I believe that if it was left to France, because the only other player on that chessboard is France, I don't think anyone else plays chess anymore. The French enjoy the wine more, but if they played chess, I think French would see merit in that relationship with Russia. And therefore, the EU-Russia relationship, and in fact the intra-EU relationship, come into play. What do your other EU partners think? Because I think the French exceptionalism allows them to embrace another exceptional actor. They grudgingly would admit that Putin is a man they can do business with, but will your other European partners be with you in that journey? So I think the EU-Russia relationship is the second relationship to watch out for, even as everyone focuses on US and China. That might be game-changing. That might change the US-China dynamic, if you can get that right.
Thank you very much, Samir. There are plenty of research on this topic at Ifri, by the way. So I will collect a few questions before giving the floor for an additional point by Patrycja. So if you want to intervene, please raise your finger.
So can I start now? Okay. Just in response to Samir, because I was impressed with your respect or admiration. Admiration for Putin's chess skills. And I wondered where it came from. Surely it's a country with a GDP per capita of Spain's, and a country that has a tremendous army, but it comes at the expense of the Russian people and their welfare, Samir. So when you look only at the external relations, it may be true, but then when you look at the Russians themselves and their lives specifically in the countryside, you could not tell it from a countryside in India. That's one point. But I'm thinking now about where this attitude to Putin is coming from, and also this admiration. And I think it's more, or maybe the admiration of this pure and sheer force that Putin introduced back into international relations, which is something I think Europe stands fundamentally against. And in this context, we have to talk about President Macron's initiative to warm up the relations with Russia. And I think we need to differentiate. While keeping in the sanctions, it is a fair argument to make that we also need to talk to Russia. Obviously, it's logical. But what is there in that talk? And here Macron points to two issues. One is counterterrorism. The other is cybersecurity and sharing intelligence. So if you come from a country like Poland or like France or like the United States, where Russia has meddled in our internal elections, which did not happen in India, I believe, then you have this second thought. Is it fair to say that we need to talk with a thief about getting rid of theft? Does it make sense? So I think we just need to be careful, because information is an asset, and sharing information, specifically classified information, is just a strange idea, but one that probably needs to be talked about. I agree.
Thank you, Patrycja. Is there some questions before finishing, or I see no one interested in asking a question? So
I can fill the gap.
Yeah, you will do the final question and the final response in that case.
That makes it easy. No, I just wanted to come back on one point, and that is the US-China relationship. And I want to kind of agree and disagree with what Samir said about it. Samir said, you know, it's not going to snap back after Trump goes, because this is not just about personalities. And Mr. Trump agrees with the deep state on China. But I would actually say that Mr. Trump is a dove on China. He's not a hawk on China. Mr. Trump's China trade policy is not about China, it's about trade. Trade is one of the very few things that Mr. Trump really cares about. And he thinks America is being diddled on trade. And that's why he's imposing these tariffs, because he's worried about bilateral trade imbalances. He has not bought in to the deep state's broader argument on China, because he doesn't care about intangible things like strategic competition and stability. The idea that Mr. Trump could care about a few half-submerged water features in the South China Sea is a joke. He doesn't care about those things. He cares about immediate payback. Now, why is this important? Because if Mr. Trump were to lose the election, rather than having a softening of American policy on China, you could actually have a hardening of American policy on China. You could have an American president who really believes in stepping up against China. And so it's not two deep states going against each other. I think we are dealing with two societies that are limbering up to really compete with each other in an unprecedented way. It's not just the deep state in America, it's the business community, it's think tanks, it's everybody. People who were hawks back in the day are now doves by comparison, because American society has passed them by. And similarly in China, when you go to China and meet with interlocutors, they are ready for the competition with the United States. So I agree with Samir that this is not about personalities. This is coming.
Well, I see two questions. And Carlos, I will let you all the chance to give a final word also for Samir and Rohinton. So Leo, please, brief question, because we should finish on time.
Do you hear me? Yeah. Let's put this way. Trump is not the president of Luxembourg, and therefore, and so you cannot. One thing you cannot accuse Trump is of any intellectual coherence. Okay. So what our chance as Europeans is that we have Trump. May we consider that in the near future he is so unskillful that it will be a great chance for Europe. And my other last very short question is this one. Who will suffer more from Trump? The United States or the rest of the world? And when he is not going to be elected, when he will quit the White House, I wish we all can burn some candles in the church, in the synagogue, in whatever you want.
Thank you. Sir, and it will be the final question.
Yeah, thanks. I worked for several think tanks, one in Washington and several in the Middle East. And a friend of mine very wisely, I think, coined a term called think tankies. and it is, the limits of debate within think tanks. So my question is, is the discussion within mainstream think tanks limited in such a way that allows for blind spots that deprive think tanks from predicting things like Brexit, or things like the ascent of Donald Trump, or things like the Arab Spring among Middle East think tanks? And that goes a little bit towards Samir's point. Are they listening to what's going on the street? These huge events have not been predicted even in the faintest sense by mainstream analysts whose job it is presumably to think outside the box. So what's the state of thinking outside the box in think tanks, and are there blind spots that this echo chamber that we've created, are there blind spots that hinder meaningful, sometimes controversial and sometimes seemingly crazy ideas from being discussed in rooms such as this?
Good question for Samir, Rohinton, and Carlos, and it will be the final words.
Which one works? This one, okay. No, I think I agree with you. I think, and I agree with what Thierry and Richard Haas had mentioned at the very beginning, that till such time that we allow our ideology to compete with the analytics, we will continue to make this mistake. I have no admiration for Putin. I'm just an observer who is seeing him intervene and change the state of play in the Middle East, become relevant in Afghanistan, interfere in some other geography and become an important actor there. And he deploys his resources well. There is no admiration for either his politics or his ideology. It is the fact that he's an actor. Now, just because I don't like him, it doesn't mean that I don't analyze him. He exists, and he is going to change, and he has already changed geopolitics as we know it in the last decade, and he's going to probably be there at least till 2024 before he becomes prime minister. So he's an actor. Now, either you can say, I won't talk to people like Xi Jinping and Putin and Erdogan and others, or you come to the fact that a rules-based order requires actors to sign on to a common code of conduct or a common consensus, and therefore you will have to deal with, like Michael said, for either your economy or for your stability or for climate change or for innovation or for any other purposes. And therefore, it is important, and the single most important task, those who are in the business of analyzing, how do you make people more responsible actors? And can we try and do that? Now, I think, for me, the initiative of Macron, or rather his ambition to normalize and harmonize or perhaps move the needle forward in the relationship with Russia is laudable, is commendable. There can be no stable supercontinent of Europe and Asia unless EU and Russia reach at least an entente or at least a terse entente, in some sense a strained entente. And that is a goal that is laudable. Now, I could virtue signal and talk about how people have treated their own people, but I guess, the torch shine backs on all of us. We have all signed on to agreements of the human rights documents at the UN, and all of us have failed. If you look at a nice report by Freedom House, they will tell you each country has been guilty of not living up to the ideals they've signed on to. But geopolitics is the art of possible, and I think it is possible if a country like France, and perhaps backed by certain other actors, could normalize and harmonize some relationship. On the blind side, I think we are an echo chamber. We are increasingly irrelevant. Streets on the Kid have more policy and political impact than us globally. In New York, they can change politics. In Europe, they can change politics. So we will have to make sure that we are able to talk to, relate to, and communicate with constituencies that matter today. I think many of us sitting in this room don't really matter, and we are kind of not happy with that reality. We have to reinvent ourselves dramatically.
Thank you. I would like to interject a question from Thierry.
No, it's not a question, it's a comment. I'm sorry but I want to react to the last question of our Saudi friend, if I understand. It's not on Putin, on Macron and Russia, by the way. I entirely approve Macron, but I cannot debate that now. It's on the question of predictability, what you call blind points. The fact of being a mathematician originally helps. Everyone has to understand that many things cannot be, it's impossible to predict specific events. It has to do with complexity. For instance, if you think of earthquakes, We know where earthquakes can happen, but it is still nowadays impossible to predict a particular earthquake even a few minutes before it occurs. But we know the fault lines, the tectonic plates, and so forth and so on. And politics is even more complex than physics. And therefore, the details of the so-called Arab Springs were radically unpredictable. We have to accept that. But we know that all empires collapse. We know that authoritarian states which are not able to reform collapse, and so forth and so on. And the art of geopolitics is not to give specific dates. It is to identify the fault lines and to make recommendations to make reforms without collapsing possible. So this is, I wanted to make this last observation because it has to do with the methodology, I think, of think tanks. And anyone who make too specific predictions with timing is bound to be wrong.
Oh, you are completely desesperated after that? Okay. Carlos, final word.
I just want to make 2 points. One is to Samir. In the case of Russia, it's a very closed economy. So you should use a PPP instead of the current exchange rate GDP. And that puts it at $3.4 trillion. It's about the size of Germany. The second thing is, I don't believe that Russia and that China and the US can come smoothly to an agreement if a current situation of liabilities lasts. Well, in that region of the South China Sea, meaning Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, China, and so forth, you have about $10 trillion. If the Chinese are successful in the medium term, that will become a renminbi area. And the seigniorage will end. Seigniorage means the difference on what you get in interest from the dollar and what you have to pay to that, to have that. I'm very sensitive to this point because up until very recently, we used to pay $40 billion a year to the American Central Bank in seigniorage. If you take that seigniorage, which I estimate at around $500 billion, who's going to pay for the armed forces, the American armed forces? Either they will have to raise taxes, and this will reduce their innovation, either they will have to cut expenditure. And that means the leveraging of the American economy. So what China wants and what the US needs to preserve are incompatible. This is my point. It's not a question of events, if someone likes or dislikes. It's a question of sheer interest. Moreover, the power structure in the US and the power structure in China, given that game, what each one wants, also leads to another incompatibility. China, up to this moment, of course it's diversifying, needs an American surplus in order to continue growing and appease the social situation so that it can have a strong regime. Let us agree that China is not a democracy. It doesn't smoothly change the president if something goes wrong, or the prime minister. You cannot call for elections, general elections, and so forth. So it needs growth, or it needs a very strong secret police, or even both. It's the history of mankind. On the other hand, the United States, because of its political cycle, and because of many other things, because of hysteresis, doesn't want to fix its public deficit. And the main cause of the trade deficit being what it is that absorption, and this is a macroeconomic notion, is bigger than what it should be. So, how do you make that compatible? Americans attack the trade when they should be attacking their public deficit. And the Chinese want to export to America to grow. Sorry. So this is, all the rest is a game with facts like the Prattle Islands and so forth, where everyone is teasing each one, but it's not coming to a real solution because the problem remains.
Thank you very much. Apparently, Michael would like a footnote, and we stop there to be on time, approximately on time.
Sorry to break the rules-based order, but I want to finish on a positive note, because, and I just want to address this point from the questioner and also from Samir that think tanks don't matter, because it occurs to me if that's what we conclude this session with, then we're going to feel pretty down about ourselves, and you guys are going to be wondering why you came to this event to begin with. And I would just say that think tanks continue to matter, that expertise matters more than ever. I don't see any diminution of appetite for Lowy Institute analysis or events, quite the opposite. I see an increase. And I think, yes, we make mistakes like anybody else. Yes, we all have blind spots. But if we continue to invest in the kind of rigorous analysis that Thierry and Richard talked about in the previous session, if we continue to be intellectually honest with ourselves, then there will continue to be demand for our work. We can't change the world in the way that Greta Thunberg can, but think tanks have rarely done that. What we can do is we can inform the world, and I predict, let me do this infamously, just as we've been saying for a couple of years we're in a post-fact world, I predict that facts are going to come roaring back and there will be a flight to quality, and that will be good for institutions like Ifri and CFR and ORF and the Lowy Institute and others. Thank you.
That was a great conclusion for our session. Thank you very much, Michael, because my job is down. Thank you, Avalos.